Shortages in affordable housing, stagnant wages, unemployment, illnesses, and substance abuse are some of the many factors that could lead one to homelessness. According to the Massachusetts Coalition for Homeless, it reported that the number of people experiencing homelessness and housing instability in Massachusetts is still very high. In the studio today, we'll be discussing homelessness in Wareham and the different efforts geared to combating the problem and hopefully annihilating it completely in the future. So join us, more information coming your way. Today in the studio, I'm joined by April Connolly, the Chief Operating Officer for Father Bill, and Pastor David Shaw from the Board of Directors of the Wareham Committee for the Homeless and also a member of the Wareham Area Clergy Association. Pastor Shaw, as the member of Wareham Area Clergy Association that oversees Nights of Hospitality, talk to us a little bit about the Nights of Hospitality efforts in helping the homeless.
Sure. This is our 10th winter of doing Nights of Hospitality. We've had between 3 and 5 churches over the years that have acted as host sites for it, and we've got a few other churches that have provided meals and staffing even though they couldn't use their own facilities. This year we have 3 churches in town that are providing facilities, and another 4 or 5 congregations that are helping out with the meals and the overnight staffing. So far this year, we've had between 5 and 14 people who have taken advantage of the hospitality each night. I think there's a total of 28 different people so far just in the last 2 weeks who have come in for shelter, including women.
Now, I know that Nights of Hospitality are opened in those coldest days in the winter, right? But this winter we had record, temperatures, wind chills and so forth. So tell me if there were any changes made into the schedule or maybe affected how many people were coming in. Did you see any changes?
Historically, we've done 12 weeks between Christmas, right after Christmas, the Sunday after Christmas, and mid-March. This year we decided to add 2 more weeks. So we started the day after Christmas and we're going to the very end of March. Those are obviously the coldest months of the year. I'm not exactly sure if I could tell you why certain numbers of people come in. The first week between Christmas and New Year's this year, we averaged about 6 people per night, and at the most, I think there were 8 one night. Whereas this, as I mentioned, the last couple nights, we've had 14 people. Sometimes I wonder if during the holiday season, friends are more likely to let them lay on their, spend the night on their couch, and so maybe we don't have as many people to deal with. Sometimes I think the same thing is true with extremely cold weather. I think some people are more likely to let them stay at their house when the temperatures are down to 0. But I don't know that we could really quantify why that happens.
So in 2017, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development reported that 17,565 people in Massachusetts counted as experiencing homelessness. So this question goes to both of you. What are some things or factors that you feel hinders progress in the effort towards annihilating homelessness?
Well, I would say the lack of affordable housing is probably the biggest driving force that causes and maintains the homeless problem. We know that it's very expensive to live in Massachusetts, and we also know that the production of affordable housing is not keeping pace with the reality of what people can afford. So local communities, private developers can work with the local community when they're developing lots and lots of housing. Usually there's a requirement to have a certain percentage of that be affordable, and private developers can often avoid having to have those set-asides. And the reality is affordable housing is really hard to develop. Father Bill's in Mainspring, has developed several units of housing, and all of it is affordable, and all of it is for the extremely low income. And what we've found is navigating all of the different funding streams, meeting all of the requirements of all of those funding sources makes it overburdensome, particularly if you're not a nonprofit, mission-driven organization. If you're a business, it's just not feasible to go through jump through all those hoops to develop affordable housing.
I was thinking the other day, our culture has become such a consumer-oriented culture. We go someplace to buy exactly what we want, and we expect it to be exactly what was advertised, and we don't want to have to invest anything other than money into it. I think the same attitude applies to neighborhoods. You know, when you buy a house, you want to buy a house in the perfect neighborhood. You don't want to have to do any work to make it any better. You want to buy a house in the perfect neighborhood. You know, I think perhaps we need to begin to think of what do I need to invest in my community or my neighborhood to make it a better neighborhood?
Now, there are a lot of speculations to factors that could lead one to being homeless. And when often you talk about homelessness or somebody's homeless, they would jump to saying they abuse drugs, that it's their fault. And you mentioned that housing, the lack of affordable housing, that's a big problem, right? Intolerance, that is a big problem, but we don't tend to hear that a lot. So from people that you're working with at Father Bill's, at Knights of Hospitality, what is the common factor? Why are they there?
So we serve about 2,000 individuals unduplicated a year in each of our shelters. So we have a shelter located in Brockton, we have a shelter in Quincy. And we ask that question when people come into our site. We ask, why are you here? What brought you here today? And the most common response to that question is financial, is I can't afford where I'm living. It's, I think the most visible homeless problem is probably those who have the most difficult challenges. They're probably the people who do struggle with mental health and substance use issues, who have a lot of behavioral health issues. Those are probably the first people most think of when they imagine or picture the homeless, right? Mm-hmm. The reality is in our population, when we look at those 2,000 unduplicated folks that we serve, about 60 to 80% of them are only with us for a couple of weeks. They only need the shelter for a couple of weeks. They come in because they either had, a fight with their spouse, or, they, hit hard times, they lost their job, and they move on without any assistance. It really is, they're using the emergency service, the emergency shelter, for what it was intended to be, which is just a crisis response while you find more stable and suitable housing. There's about 20 to 30% of our population who do struggle with significant challenges. And those are the folks that have been homeless the longest, often are service resistant, have experienced serious trauma and serious mental illness, and often have the most difficulty entering into mainstream housing. And I think those are the folks that most people imagine and picture when they think of the homeless, but they really are a small subset of a much wider problem that's related to housing, affordable housing.
10 years ago, the winter of 2008 and 2009, we had a handful of people that came in for shelter, and they were largely people who had been working as, I would call them, day laborers, working with a contractor someplace. And that was the beginning of the explosion of that housing bubble and the financial downturn, the beginning of the Great Recession. And their common story was that they, with houses not being constructed, they lost their job, and then a month or two later, they lost the apartment that they were living in. They had been living hand to mouth as it was, and when things went down, they lost their jobs. Many of them were probably upper 30s, 40-year-olds. Over the next few years, we got several people that were in their 60s. Mental health was one of the issues among some of that population, but not all of them. In more recent years, we've had more people in their 20s and early 30s, and much of that, I guess the presenting problem tends to be more the alcohol and the drug use. But we still have people from 20 years old to 65 or 70 years old. Sometimes it's a divorce. Sometimes it's, as you mentioned, oftentimes it's just a very short-term thing. A husband and wife have an argument and one kicks the other out and they show up for a few nights and then they're back home. So it's a real range of things.
So, okay, I'm happy that you mentioned all those factors, because once again, we don't see that. We normally just see that one image, that somebody abusing drugs or somebody suffering from mental illnesses. And there's that stigma of people who are homeless made themselves homeless and they want to stay there. So what are issues or areas that are not met or need more assistance when fighting homelessness?
Well, I would say for Father Bills and Mainspring, the majority of the folks we serve in the emergency shelter, again, are going to resolve their homelessness on their own. The people that we really try to target our resources and supports and services to are those more challenging, the folks that come with more challenges to re-entering housing, the people who have typically more significant behavioral health issues. And I would say for that population, the services is the biggest challenge for us, delivering the services. We could develop hundreds of units of housing, but to give the support that's needed to those folks in transitioning into housing requires resources too, and to make sure that we're supporting people as they transition from living outside to living in an apartment. That's a huge transition for them to make. We had a person this is probably a 10-year-old story, but a person who came into housing from years and years of living outside, had developed relationships outside, other people who were experiencing homelessness. They had a whole community, and they came into housing, and the first weekend they had everyone who they were connected to outside staying in their one room. So we had rented a room to them, and they had everybody over because they wanted to welcome all of their friends and family into their apartment to get them out of the cold. And so that Monday, the person shows up at our offices with their key and gives it back and says, "Here, I know you're going to kick me out because I had all these people in my apartment." And the assumption is I'm going to get kicked out, I'm going to go back to the street because that's what I'm used to. I'm used to getting kicked out of places. I'm used to losing my housing. And we, of course, responded with, "No, keep your key. And no, you can't have 5 or 6 people sleeping in your room. It's for you, and you have to," but understanding that transition is really hard for people.
Now, you mentioned about the struggles of taking somebody who has been chronically homeless and giving them housing. And you have, Father Bill has been helping the homeless for decades. Mm-hmm. Now, here in Wareham, Father Bill, together with Turning Point, Buzzards Bay Coalition, and Wareham Land Trust, resulted in providing permanent housing to 6 individuals who were chronically homeless. Let's talk a little bit about that project. What were behind the scenes, evaluating who was going to be in there and the conditions of keeping your housing. So touch upon that a little bit.
Sure. And so, prior to the Walton House coming online, the partnership between Turning Point and Father Bills and Mainspring had resulted in almost 20 individuals receiving housing, and some, and about over 10 of those were in permanent supported housing. So the Walton House wasn't the first permanent supported housing project that we were able to see come to fruition. It's the first project that we've developed as a partnership with the Land Trust and the town, and we're really excited about that. But anytime you bring a project online that is housing multiple people who have experienced long-term homelessness, there are expected challenges. And what I would, so behind the scenes, what we do in terms of our tenant selection is every person who comes into our housing is screened for a criminal background. Our staff develop relationships with every person that we house. So we have case management in the community that that meets with people on a regular basis prior to housing, and then once they are housed, they are regularly visited by a case manager. And so through that process of getting to know people and getting to know sort of what kind of housing they're looking for, what kind of housing is best for them, whether it's a shared living situation or a scattered site, more private apartment, we place people into housing that way. So there's no time limit on how long they can stay. They pay rent. And so a lot of people think that our housing is free. Every person who lives in our housing pays 30% of their income towards the rent. And so there is accountability there, and there's ownership there. And so if they don't have an income, we work with them on gaining an income. So they may not pay rent right as they enter housing, but we'll work with them on gaining an income, and as they do that, they would then contribute to the rent.
Good. Now, when it comes to dealing with homelessness, I think another issue is the lack of empathy. And I do not know if we as a society have grown desensitized by the images and the reality of homelessness, or we see that the problem has grown too big for us to deal with. So how do you guys tackle this issue, the lack of empathy?
In part by setting an example. And if I can speak candidly, again, putting my pastor hat on, Jesus Christ set the example of reaching out to the last, the least, and the lost. And I think he calls us to do the same. So the churches that provide shelter for homeless people here in town recognize that by reaching out to the last, the least, and the lost, we are ultimately improving the conditions for living in this town. As some boats begin to rise, it raises the boats throughout the town. So we're trying to set an example of empathy and practical ways of helping people who desperately need it.
I think it's also a lot of people who don't have direct exposure to the people we serve, whether it's the Knights of Hospitality or Turning Point or Father Bill's in Mainspring. There's a lot of stigma attached to homelessness, and for those who don't know the story, it's very easy to assume you assume the worst of people, right? And when you sit with someone who has experienced tremendous trauma in their lives, who have been assaulted and taken advantage of, and not cared for by the very people who they're supposed to be cared for throughout their lives, and you start to understand why someone at the age of 50 might have a serious alcohol problem, or might have serious mental illness, and might not be able to sort of just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. When you hear that story, you can kind of begin to have more compassion versus assuming that someone is just not willing. If you see a shelter operate at night, you'll understand that no one wants to live in a shelter. No one wants to share a room with 75 other people in bunk beds. No one would want that life. And it's only because of the pain that they've experienced in their lives that they're not able to sort of just get themselves out of it. And that's where our missions are so important, but also just make a lot of sense. Yeah. Housing for these folks is not just best for them. It's best for all of us. It's more affordable. It's more cost effective than sheltering people. And ultimately, it's better for communities. And it ends a problem versus just managing it in a crisis response.
It's also helpful, I think, for people to realize how close to homelessness most of us are. I know people that are in their early 80s and are living in a house that their family has owned for decades here in town, but now they're retired, they're living on a fixed income, the property taxes become unmanageable for them, and I know some people who are housed in their own homes who are virtually on the the cusp of being homeless in that kind of a scenario. A couple gets divorced. It's an extraordinary financial challenge now for both of those individuals to be able to pay for housing. People who are working at minimum wage jobs. You lose your job, you lose your house. I mean, there are a lot of people in Wareham who are one paycheck away from being homeless. And if we stop to think for a moment, that could be my story too, we might be more empathetic.
Very good. So this is not about their problem versus my problem, it's everybody. And that if we can help the homeless, we are helping all of us. And the idea that you never know when it's going to be your turn, or there are so many factors and you never know when your day is going to be. So just be out there and be helpful and be mindful of the situations. So do you think is there a victory to this battle? Because I've heard a lot of factors that impedes victory. But I would like to think that one day there will be a victory. There will be no homelessness. Is this a dream or is this a reality?
We believe progress? It. Yeah, okay. And I would say, we certainly believe that we can end homelessness. Okay. There will always be people who hit hard times, right? We're not, there are so many things beyond our control that are we're not going to prevent people from facing homelessness. What we can do a better job of is not warehousing people once they become homeless in emergency shelters that aren't equipped to really get people back into housing. What we can do better is really trying to understand why they're facing their housing crisis and how to end that housing crisis as quickly as possible. And we can use our resources more efficiently to do that. Giving someone a 12-month rental voucher is far more affordable than paying for them to stay in shelter for a year. It's about a third the cost to give someone housing where they're contributing. They're able then to focus on getting back to work, to engaging with treatment, to working with whatever they need to work with to stabilize their lives, than it is to put them into an emergency shelter where they're sharing space with sometimes 10, sometimes 100 people, and expecting them to just resolve their problem on their own. It's just a more cost-effective way to respond to homelessness.
Several years ago, a number of the people here in Wareham that had some connection to the homeless issue got together, and we put together a plan called the Plan to End Homelessness in Wareham. We had a debate about whether that was the appropriate title, because one might say, poverty will be with us forever, probably. But, the goal is to end homelessness. And when I think about the fact that in just the last 4 or 5 years that Father Bills and Mainspring has been involved here in Wareham along with Turning Point, we have housed 30 or 40 people who were chronically homeless before that. That's a huge chunk out of that homeless population here. So, I mean, with every passing year in the last few years, it's like, well, maybe it would be possible to end homelessness here if enough people get behind it. And it's everybody from homeless people saying, I want to get out of this lifestyle and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this happen. I know a gentleman who I've known now for 15 years who's been homeless, who was just placed in a subsidized housing program here in town. I hope I never see him on the street again. At one end of the spectrum is that. At the other end of the spectrum are landlords who we hope would be willing to rent their apartments, subsidized apartment for a homeless person. And everybody else in between has a part to play in this.
Absolutely. And you did mention that Turning Point is there to help people not to be homeless. So I think that's another way of kind of minimizing the issue, if not annihilating it completely, is working with those who are almost homeless in trying to help them stay standing.
This is where this kind of three-way partnership is working so well. At Nights of Hospitality, we have probably the most immediate connection to chronically homeless people in town. we are able to introduce them to an outreach worker from Father Bill's in Mainspring who is able to ultimately get them into a subsidized housing program. Turning Point's primary focus, primary mission is on preventing people from becoming homeless. So it's advocating with the utility companies to get a payment plan, advocating with landlords to work out a payment plan so people don't lose their apartments, giving some financial resources to help people get through this next 2 months that they know are going to be rough. So between the three of us, we're able to help people who are chronically homeless on one end and on the verge of becoming homeless on the other.
Very good. Well, thank you both for being with me in this studio. I have learned a lot, and thank you for all the information that you have shared. To my viewers, thank you for being with us. Again, it was I, Queen Banda from WCTV, and with me in the studio was Miss April Connolly, the Chief Operating Officer for Father Bill's, and Pastor David Shaw, the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Wareham Committee for the Homeless, and also a member of Wareham Area Ecology Association. Thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye.